Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Texas Podcast. I am your host, Gabe, and today we're going to be starting on the Siege of the Alamo. The Siege of the Alamo, which started February 23rd, 1836, and ended on March 6, 1836, describes the first 13 days of the Battle of the Alamo. On February 23rd, Mexican troops under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna entered San Antonio de Bejar. They surrounded the Alamo mission. The Alamo was defended by a small force of Texans and Tejanos led by William Barrett Travis and James Bowie, and it also included Davy Crockett. Before beginning his assault on the Alamo, Santa Anna offered them one last chance to surrender. Travis replied by opening fire on the Mexican forces, and in doing so effectively sealed their fate. When Mexican troops departed San Antonio de Bejar, Texan soldiers established a garrison at the Alamo mission, a former Spanish religious outpost which had been converted to a makeshift fort. Described by Santa Anna as an irregular fortification hardly worth of the name, the Alamo had been designed to withstand an attack by native tribes, not an artillery-equipped army. The complex sprawled across 3 acres, providing almost 1,320 feet of perimeter to defend. The interior plaza was bordered on the east chapel and to the south by a one-story building known as the Low Barracks. A wooden palisade stretched between those 2 buildings. The 2-story-long barracks extended north from the chapel, and at the northern corner of the east wall stood a cattle pen and a horse corral. The walls surrounding the complex were at least 2.75 feet thick and ranged from 9 to 12 feet high. On February 11th, the commander of the Alamo, James C. Neal, left the Alamo, likely to recruit additional reinforcements and gather supplies. In his absence, the garrison was jointly commanded by newcomers William Barrett Travis, a regular Army officer, and James Bowie, who had commanded a volunteer company. As the Texans struggled to find men and supplies, Santa Anna's army began marching north on February 12th, and they crossed the Rio Grande. On February 16th and February 18th, local resident Ambrosio Rodriguez warned his good friend William Barrett Travis that the relatives further south claimed that Santa Anna was on a march towards Bejar. 2 days later, Juan Seguin's scout Blas Maria Herrera reported that the vanguard of the Mexican army had crossed the Rio Grande. There had been many rumors of Santa Anna's imminent arrival, but Travis ignored them. For several hours that night, a war of counsel was held at the Alamo, and they argued over whether to believe the rumors. Travis was convinced that the Mexican army would not arrive in Bejar until at least mid-March. He and the other Texans thought that Santa Anna would not march until spring, when the grass had begun to grow again. They overlooked the fact that mesquite grass sprouted earlier than normal grass. Travis had also assumed that Santa Anna would not have begun gathering troops for an invasion of Texas until after he learned of Cosa's defeat. The Texans did not realize that Santa Anna had begun preparations for an invasion months before. Despite the Texan belief, by the evening of February 20th, many of the residents of Bejar began to pack their belongings in preparation for leaving. The next day, 15 of the Tejano volunteers at the Alamo resigned. Seguin had asked Travis to release the men so that they could help evacuate their families who were in the path of Santa Anna. Santa Anna had crossed the Rio Grande on February 16th. Next night, his army camped at the Nueces River, 119 miles from Bejar. Texans had previously burned the bridge over the Nueces, forcing the Mexicans to build a makeshift structure of branches and dirt in the pouring rain. The delay was brief, and on February 19th, the vanguard of the army camped along the Frio River, 68 miles from Bejar. The following day, they reached Hondo, less than 50 miles away. By 1:45 p.m. on February 21st, Santa Anna and his vanguard had reached the banks of the Medina River, 25 miles from Bejar. Waiting there were dragoons under Colonel Ramirez Susma, who had arrived the previous evening. With no idea that the Mexican army was so close, all but 10 members of the Alamo garrison joined about 2,000 Bejar residents at a fiesta to celebrate George Washington's birthday. Centralists in Bejar soon alerted Santa Anna to the party, and he ordered General Ramirez Susma to lead a cavalry force to take the Alamo while the garrison celebrated elsewhere. The raid had to be called off when sudden rains made the Medina unfordable. The next night, Santa Anna and his army camped at Leon Creek, 8 miles west of what is now downtown San Antonio. In the early hours of February 23rd, residents began fleeing Bejar, fearing the Mexican army's imminent arrival. Although unconvinced by the reports, Travis stationed a soldier in the San Fernando Church bell tower, the highest location in town, to watch for signs of an approaching force. Travis then sent Captain Philip DeMitt and Lieutenant Benjamin Noble to scout for the Mexican army locations. At approximately 2:30 that afternoon, the church bell began to ring. Soldiers stationed in the tower claimed to have seen flashes in the distance. Dimmitt and Noble had not returned, so Travis sent Dr. James Sutherland and John W. Smith on horseback to scout the area. Smith and Sutherland spotted members of the Mexican cavalry within 1.5 miles of the town and returned to Behar at a run. According to later reports from Santa Ana, the cavalry under General Joaquin Ramirez Sesma were supposed to execute a surprise attack on the morning of February 23rd. Historian Tom Ricks Lindy concluded that Sesma's troops had captured a Texan spy, Trinidad Coy, who lied about a Texan ambush further ahead, prompting Sesma to halt at 7 a.m. and wait for reinforcements. Historian Lon Tinkle speculated that the combination of the church bell ringing and the sight of the two Texan scouts led Sesma to believe that the Texans were planning an assault on the cavalry. At this point, there were approximately 156 effective Texan soldiers in the Alamo, with another 14 in the hospital. The men were completely unprepared for the arrival of the Mexican army and had no food in the mission. The men quickly herded cattle in the Alamo and scrounged for food in nearby houses. They were able to gather enough beef and corn into the Alamo to last a month. The Alamo garrison also had a large supply of captured Mexican muskets with over 19,000 paper cartridges, but only a limited supply of powder for the artillery. Several members of the garrison dismantled the blacksmith shop of Antonio Saez and moved much of the material into the Alamo. A few members of the garrison brought their families into the Alamo to keep them safe. Among these was Almiron Dickinson, who fetched his wife Susanna and their daughter Angelina, and Bowie, who brought his deceased wife's cousin Navarro and Juan Navarro Asbury, and the Asbury's young son into the fort. It is likely that Navarro and Asbury also brought their family servants, Sam and Betty. While the bulk of the garrison prepared for the attack, a few Texans remained in Behar and raised a flag in the middle of the military plaza. According to historian J.R. Edmondson, the flag was a variation of the Mexican tricolor with two stars, representing the separated states of Texas and Coahuila. Gleaming from the white center bar within an hour, the first of the Mexican cavalry commanded by Colonel Jose Vicente Minon entered Behar. The Texans lowered their flag and they brought it into the Alamo. As the Mexican cavalry approached, Travis dispatched a man named John Johnson to ask Colonel James Fannin 100 miles southeast to send reinforcements immediately. Travis then sent Smith and Sutherland to bring a message to the Alcalde at Gonzales 70 miles away. The note to Gonzales read, "The enemy in large force is in sight. We want men and provisions. Send them to us. We have 150 men and are determined to defend the Alamo to the last." By late afternoon, Behar was occupied by around 1,500 Mexican troops, who quickly raised a blood-red flag signifying no quarter. Soon after, Mexican buglers sounded the request for parley. Travis ordered the Alamo's 18-pounder cannon fired. The Mexican army responded with 4 balls of 7-inch howitzers. The balls hit the interior of the Alamo but caused no damage or injuries. Santa Ana later reported that the initial Texan cannon fire killed 2 Mexican soldiers and wounded 8 others. No other Mexican officer, however, reported fatalities from that day. Bowie believed that Travis had acted hastily and sent Green B. Jameson to meet with Santa Ana. Jameson carried a letter addressed to the commander of the invading forces from Behar and signed Commander of the Volunteers of Behar. Angry that Bowie presented himself as Santa Anna's equal, the Mexican general refused to meet with Jameson, but allowed Colonel Juan Almonte and his Jose Bartras to barley. Almonte later said that Jameson asked for honorable surrender, but Bartras replied, "I reply to you according to the order of His Excellency that the Mexican army cannot come to terms with any conditions with rebellious foreigners to whom there is no recourse left. If they wish to save their lives, then to place themselves immediately at the disposal of supreme government, from whom alone they may expect clemency after some considerations." Travis was angered that Bowie had acted unilaterally and sent his own emissary to the Mexican army. He received the same response. Bowie and Travis then mutually agreed to fire the cannon again. By the time the parleys were over, it was nightfall, and the firing ceased. That evening, the Mexicans erected an artillery battery near the Veramendi house. Santa Ana also sent General Ventura Moros' cavalry to circle to the north and east of the Alamo to prevent the arrival of Texan reinforcements. According to Edmondson, the Texans sent a small party to forage that evening. They returned with 6 pack mules and a prisoner, a Mexican soldier who would later be used to interpret Mexican bugle calls. The Texans received one reinforcement that night when one of Juan Seguin's men, Gregorio Esparza, arrived with his family. Texan sentries refused to open the gate, but others helped the family climb through the window of the chapel. Several other Texan soldiers were unable to make it into the Alamo. DeMitt and Noble, who had been scouting for signs of the Mexican army, were told by a local that Behar was surrounded and that they would be unable to re-enter the town. Andrew Jackson Sowell and Bird Lockhart had been out that morning looking for provisions. On hearing that the Alamo was surrounded, they left to their homes in Gonzales. February 24th. On Wednesday, February 24th marked the first full day of the siege. Throughout the day, the Mexican army recornered the Alamo defenses. At 11 a.m., Santa Anna accompanied the cavalry on a scouting mission, coming within musket shot of the Alamo. Later that afternoon, Santa Anna personally presided over the distribution of shoes to some members of his army. At roughly the same time, he ordered a Mexican artillery battery consisting of 2 8-pound cannons and a mortar located 350 yards from the Alamo to begin firing. Mexican Colonel Juan Almonte wrote in his diary that 2 of the Alamo guns, including the massive 18-pound cannon, were dismounted. The Texans were unable to bring them back into service quickly. Bowie had been ill, and at some point during the day he collapsed and was confined to bed. Fearing that he was contagious, Bowie moved into a small room in the low barracks along the south wall of the mission. Travis was now in sole command of the garrison. That afternoon, Travis wrote a letter addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, which is, according to Mary Petit, considered by many as one of the masterpieces of American patriotism. Travis sent the letter with courier Albert Martin, who delivered it to Gonzales. There, Lancelot Smithers took custody of the message and delivered it to San Felipe, where it was read by Governor Henry Smith. Smith told the colonists at San Felipe to fly to the aid of your besieged countrymen and not permit them to be massacred by a mercenary foe. The call is upon all who are able to bear arms to rally without one moment's delay, or in 15 days the heart of Texas will be at the seat of war. The letter was eventually reprinted throughout the United States and much of Europe. In the early evening, Mexican Colonel Juan Bringas led scouts across a footbridge over the San Antonio River. Texan sharpshooters quickly killed one Mexican soldier, and the Mexican retreated. But Davy Crockett managed to drop a second man before the enemy finally reached over. Throughout the night, the Mexican artillery sporadically bombarded the church and long barracks, while the Mexican army fired muskets and shouted to fool the Texans into believing that an assault was imminent. Santa Anna had also ordered that his military band serenade the Texans throughout the night. Mexican soldiers took advantage of the darkness and the distractions of the countrymen to erect 2 more artillery batteries around the Alamo. The 2 batteries combined to hold 2 18-pound cannons and 2 6-pound cannons, 2 4-pound cannons, and 2 7-inch howitzers. One of the batteries was located along the right bank of the San Antonio River, approximately 1,000 feet from the south wall of the Alamo. The other was located 1,000 feet east of the eastern wall. By the end of the first day of the siege, the Mexican army had been reinforced by 600 of Sesma's troops. Antonio Gaona and the 1st Brigade were still several days' march away, while an additional 400 to 500 men and most of the Mexican artillery were struggling through mud south of Behar. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.